Ready? All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Lee. I heard you way down here. Talk to the people in front of me. Good evening. Welcome to our last community meeting of this quarter. Thank you to all who came out this evening. We have 1 hour to share a little bit about myself, my background, my experiences, and some of the information regarding our plans for the Little Rock School District this evening. And afterwards, if there are any questions or comments, we will open up for questions or feedback. All right. So again, thank you for coming out. It's such a small, intimate group this evening. I almost feel like we should do personal introductions just so that we know who is in the room, but I will skip that. But I'll just ask a couple of questions before we get started. If you are a parent, raise your hand. Okay. Employee. All right. Community member. And other. What is other? Okay. I didn't specifically say auntie or great auntie, but okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Sir? AD. Okay, all right. So welcome. Oh, yeah, I recognize your face. Yes. All right, so I'll just jump right in it. My name is Jamal Wright, for those of you who don't know who I am, and I am the proud, new, and excited new superintendent of the Little Rock School District. And so I will, again, spend a few minutes, again, just give you a little bit of information about my background. I am a Florida native. Jacksonville, Florida is my hometown. And this is a picture of the home where I grew up. Born and raised, started my career in Jacksonville and lived there for the first 30 or 31 years of my life. There's a picture, some various pictures of my family, and probably like many of you, my family is extremely important to me. I tend to describe our family as the most functional, dysfunctional family on the face of this earth. And so any cast of characters that you can think about that is represented in a family, my family is no exception. I'm not going to tell you what role I play, but you'll just have to figure that out as we go along. These are my siblings. I am the last of 4 living children. There were 5 of us. My oldest sister passed a while ago. Actually, she passed before I was born. But these are my 3 siblings who I was going to say who I was raised with, but there's such an age gap between us that I only grew up in the home with my youngest sister, Sean, who was 10 years older than me. My oldest brother, I think math was not my major. Let's just say there's a wide gap, at least 30, 35 years. Yeah. Yeah, because he's older. Of course, as you can see, I'm the baby of the family, and so anything that you know about the baby of the family, any type of stereotypes or characteristics of the baby of the family, it probably applies to me. These are my parents. Sweating a little. These are my parents, Nathaniel and Helen Wright. And I'll start by talking about my dad for just a minute. My father is the most influential person in my life and the person who I have modeled my life after for various reasons. He passed away in 2013, and it wasn't until I was probably 25, 30 years old that I realized just how strategic and valuable he was to me. He's a very strict guy. I grew up and didn't really get a chance to do as much as some of my peers and friends, but I definitely appreciate the example that he set for me. He was the hardest working person on the face of this earth, at least that I knew. He worked a regular 9 to 5. He was a civil service employee at the Naval Air Station, one of the bases in Jacksonville, and he retired after 36 years of service. His last 12 or 13 years, he never missed a day of work. And so every single year growing up, as a reward for his attendance and his work performance, he was always given a family cruise to the Bahamas. And so I was one of very few kids in my neighborhood who actually got a chance to spend time on cruise ships and traveling to the Bahamas, so much so to where I would never go back there today. And I have not done cruises probably since I was 17 or 18 because I was tired of cruises and tired of going to the Bahamas. It was the same ship, actually. And so after a while, you just kind of memorize everything about the ship, the schedules, and everything else, but I definitely appreciate that experience. He was also an entrepreneur before I even knew what the word entrepreneur meant. He and my uncle owned a fuel oil company in Jacksonville. And how many of you remember having like kerosene tanks on the side of your house? So back in the day, you had to have kerosene in order to heat your homes. And so we would drive around the trucks and fill orders after school. I would answer the phone at the business and take orders and ride the truck with my dad and uncle. And so I got a chance to see what it meant to be the ultimate provider for his family. And he was also a pastor. And so I am a PK, and again, everything you know about pastors' kids, all the mischievous characteristics that you can think about, I learned how to do wrong growing up in church. And then this is my mom. Although in elementary school, a lot of people didn't know I had a mom because my dad was just so active in everything that I did. He was a person that was at every PTA meeting. He was the PTA president in middle and high school. Showed up at all the games that I played, very active. My mom was the complete opposite. She was a homemaker, never worked and took care of the home, but she spoiled me to death. And so I am a true mama's boy. Whenever my dad would say no, my mom would always say yes. My mom she'll be 89 September 1st and is still in great health, still drives. Although she has restrictions, she's not supposed to drive after 5 o'clock, but you'll call sometimes on the evenings and she's at church or at choir rehearsal, and I ask, well, how did you get there? And she'll say, well, I drove, and she can't hardly see, so you shouldn't be on the road at night. But I'm thankful that she's still here, and she's still very nosy, even though I'm way here in Arkansas. She still tries to keep tabs on what I'm doing and where I'm going, and I was going to say who I'm with, but that's too much information. But that's my mom. These are my 3 babies. Well, they're not babies anymore. These are some throwback pictures of my 3 kids. They are 20, 18, and Josh will be 16 in next week. Yeah, next week. My oldest son in the top left-hand corner, he is beginning his junior year, or will be beginning his junior year at Florida State. My daughter just graduated high school, and I don't have the energy today to talk about her future plans in our relationship and how much we fight about what she's going to do. So just stay tuned, and we'll see how that works out. And then my youngest son, down in the bottom right-hand corner, that's Josh. My goal for him is just to complete high school. And if he completes high school successfully, that will be one of the greatest accomplishments of my life. And so those are my 3 babies. Already mentioned that my dad was a pastor, and so much of my early childhood and up until my young adulthood was pretty much spent in church. So church gave me all the experiences in terms of first leadership experiences, participating in all different types of things. And so I'll just leave it at that. But I know it still paid off, even though I don't go as much today as I did then. But pray for me. I'm going to come back to those folks in just a minute, but I do want to talk about a couple of seminal moments in my life that have really impacted me and really informs my approach and my practices and my beliefs in terms of an educator. And so growing up, I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. The first teacher that I had a chance to experience was actually my mom. I tell this joke too. The first superintendent that I knew was actually my mom. Can anybody guess what type of superintendent she was? She was a Sunday school superintendent. And before she became the Sunday school superintendent, she was actually she taught the kindergarten Sunday school class. And so growing up, I would always assist her and help her prepare for her Sunday school lessons. And eventually, I think by the time I was 6th or 7th grade, I actually started teaching the Sunday school class. And so that was my first experience being a teacher. And so growing up, like I said, I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. It was in high school because of the relationship that I had with my high school principal that I knew that I wanted to eventually become a principal. So when I went to undergrad, I went to the University of North Florida. And the way that I grew up and the environment in which I grew up in Jacksonville, the north side of town, which was pretty much predominantly black. And the areas, the schools that I went to, with the exception of elementary school where I was bused across town, but all of my other experiences were around other people who looked like me. And the way in which I grew up, we were always taught to be proud of who we were. I never knew anything about being inferior to anybody else because of race. Grew up very proud, very confident, didn't think that I was any different or less smart than anyone else. So when I got to college at the University of North Florida, which was a predominantly white institution at the time when I went, the African American population was probably less than 10%. So I took a class called sociology. It was either a regular sociology class or sociology of education, I can't remember. But in one of our assignments and one of our readings, we spent time talking about public, well, not necessarily public ed, but educational outcomes. And in these readings, at the bottom of every statistic, every category, every time you read something, whether it was academic achievement, whether it was special education outcomes, African American students were always at the bottom of the list, and African American males in particular. And so it was in this class for the very first time in my life that I actually felt a little embarrassed about being black. And I was in a class with majority other white students, and so of course when you talk about issues of race and outcomes, and everybody looks at you for a response. And so it was actually in this moment that I made a vow and a promise to myself that when I became a teacher and when I became an educator, that I was going to do everything in my power to make sure that children who look like me did not become one of the statistics that I read about. And so that was a seminal moment that has impacted me until this very day. I actually began my career in education in a private Christian school, the Potter's House Christian Academy, and I had a picture here of some non-family influential people in my life. The first two are two of my former teachers, and one in particular, Miss Fackler in the middle. These individuals make me feel like I was the smartest kid in the world. And again, it just shows the power and the impact that educators and just adults in general can have on children when they continue to speak life into them and when they continue to tell them how smart and bright they are, even though it may not be necessarily true. I think I was told that so much to where in my mind I felt like I was the smartest person on earth. But the last picture are my pastors, and they are here because they had an enormous impact on me as an individual and as an educator. And so they allowed me, with my crazy self, to actually come and teach in a school that they founded. My pastor's wife was an educator, and she left the educational system to found the Potter's House Christian Academy. It was a K-12 school of about 600 kids. We started out with grades K-3 through third grade, and the second year we added grades 4 and 5, and that was the year that I joined. And so I taught fifth grade at the Potter's House for 3 years, and middle school social studies for a couple of years. We added one grade every single year until we got to the 12th grade. So I taught from 97 to 2001. Within that time, I got married, and back in this day, the public school teacher salary was much more lucrative than it was when you were teaching in private school. And so after I got married, I decided to transition to public education, I thought, to make the big bucks. I got a few chuckles. That was actually the second joke I told. The first one you all didn't laugh, so I think that just went over your head. So I taught in public school for a year in St. Johns County, St. Augustine, Florida, which is like a 30-minute drive from Jacksonville. And before that year was over, they asked me to come back and to serve as the first secondary school principal. And so I came back and served as principal of grades 6 to 12 from 2002 to 2006. Had a chance to graduate our first graduating class in 2005 which happened to be the exact same class that I started teaching during my first year teaching in 1997. And so that was a very special moment to have a chance to graduate the students that I clearly messed up with when I first started teaching, because I had no clue what I was doing. So I was happy that they survived and could read a little because, again, I had no clue what I was doing. Left, moved to Gainesville, Florida, packed up and started a doctoral program at the University of Florida. Go Gators. Okay. We know that the University of Florida is the best SEC team. Yes, it is. I mean, anybody who has a pig for a... Anyway, all right, so I started a doctoral program at the University of Florida and also worked as an assistant principal in the public school system there. Again, I was there for 1 year, and before the year was over, my pastors asked me to come back again, and this time my Narlene McLaughlin, who was the founder and the administrator, the headmaster of the school, wanted to kind of step away and do other things. And so I came back to serve as the headmaster of the entire school for a year. And then I finally took the public school plunge forever. I had a good relationship with the superintendent of Duval County Public Schools during this particular time. And because of the work that we were doing in the Potter's House, although it was a private school, it was probably one of the largest private schools that primarily taught all African American children in Jacksonville. And so we had some great accomplishments. And so I allowed him to talk me into taking my first public school principalship at SP Livingston Elementary School, which was a F-rated elementary school in Duval County. And so there were several lessons that I learned during my experience there. And the first lesson was around ethical leadership. I always run out of time, so I'm making sure I keep on pace. And so in this particular school, we had a challenging neighborhood population of students, grades K through 5, but we also was one of 2 schools within the system that educated or housed what we call the EBD unit, or the emotional behavioral disturbed unit. And so in the back of the school, in a separate building, there were 8 or 9 different classes of kids in grades K to 5 who were labeled or classified with EBD. And so during my tour of the school, I remember this vividly as if it was yesterday. I remember walking back to the back of the building, because you know that's where they put all the kids that nobody really wants to deal with. They're separate and in the back of the building. And when they opened the door, I walked down the hallway and you could just hear screams and yelling. It sounded like almost like a mild mental institution. Inside of the classrooms, there were timeout rooms in every room. And so as the person was walking me around, they would open the door and I would peek in and I would see, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids in the room. Sometimes you have a kid crying in the timeout room. And when we got to the center of the wing, this is where it really got a little, can't even think of the word to use, got a little crazy for me. So in the middle of the wing, there were 6 timeout rooms, 3 in the front, 3 in the back. And so this is where they took kids for timeout, intervention, or whatever you want to call it. But you would see kids really being pulled, sometimes drugged down the hallway, put in these timeout rooms. There were no locks on the doors, but they would take broomstick handles or other things to kind of put in the doors to keep the kids from coming out. And so kids would be banging on the door, banging on the walls. I mean, it was a crazy, crazy scene. I didn't have the words to really describe what I saw, but I just know deep down inside that this just wasn't right. It didn't feel right. It didn't look right. And as you probably can imagine, when you think about the kids who were in this program, I mean, it was almost 100 kids back in this back wing. Almost all of the kids were African American kids. And the great majority of the students who were in this wing were African American males. And so, before inclusion became the thing, I made wasn't necessarily a good reputation with my faculty, but I wanted to make sure that these kids had exposure to the general ed curriculum, and so I didn't follow all of the IEP rules. We didn't call a meeting to change the setting. I just started doing stuff. And eventually, I think we became more of an inclusive environment over time, but we still never achieved the type of inclusive climate that I would have wanted in a school for kids with disabilities. So the second thing was that my boss at the time, when I was reviewing the data and looking at test scores and looking at the data, every single year that the kids tested, they only tested 95% of the students, which was the minimum requirement for federal law that still stands today. And so when I dug down a little deeper, you can imagine the 5% of the kids that were not tested every single year, you can imagine who those kids were. Who were they? It was all the kids, all the kids in that back wing. And so I was faced with a decision. My boss said to continue the same practices because we were an F school and they wanted the scores to increase, and I chose not to. So we tested 100% of the kids my first year, and so we moved from an F to a what? F minus. Somebody heard this before. Yes. What letter? G. We were a G school after that first year. But I don't regret the decision. Don't regret it at all because I knew it was the right thing to do. The second year, did a lot of work, had a lot of focus on better classroom instruction, and so we did improve our scores after the second year. I think we went from we went from an F to a C, but I don't necessarily applaud that because as soon as I left the school, the grades plummeted, went back to a D, eventually went back to an F, and eventually today the school is an early childhood center, so it just didn't work. And one of the reasons why is because one of the things I learned is that you cannot test prep or take shortcuts or gimmicks to improve student achievement. You have to do it the right way. And so sustainable change takes time, and it takes you focusing on those things that really matter, and those aren't really necessarily quick fixes. One other important lesson, I cannot forget this. I had a seasoned teacher in the building. Her name was Miss Miller. And at this time, I believe I was probably 26, 27, 28, very young, leading this school. And I kind of had the big head thinking that I was going to come to the school and tell everybody what to do and fire people and just get rid of everybody. And Miss Miller pulled me to the side one day. I was going to say almost literally pulled me, but I just kind of pulled me on my shirt and asked me to come inside her classroom. And she sat me down and she said to me, I may not be the best teacher, I may not know all of the latest strategies and things to use, but you are not going to talk to us in demeaning ways, you're not going to be disrespectful to us, you're going to have to respect us in order for us to work with you. And so in a very nice and stern way, she got me together very, very quickly and helped me to realize that you can't treat people any type of way and expect for folks to be able to follow and listen to you. And so I thank Ms. Miller to this day because she has always made me realize that regardless of what type of decisions you need to make, you always have to treat people with dignity and respect. And that was a lesson that I learned from Ms. Miller. So I left there, had some life experiences, divorce. You're supposed to clap. Okay, all right. This was the first audience that joke kind of like fell flat. Other places, they actually like laugh. So, side note, never say that again. All right. So, got divorced and wanted a different setting. I had lived in Florida all of my life, didn't necessarily know exactly where I wanted to go, what I want to do, but I received this random email from this lady named, well, I know it didn't come from her, it came from her team, Michelle Reed, who had became the infamous chancellor of DC Public Schools. This was back in the early 2000s when DC lost their school board. They went to mayoral control, and they brought in the first Asian superintendent or chancellor to lead that system. And so they were on a national recruitment to recruit principals to come to DC. So I filled out the little online thing, eventually got an interview, went up, and was provided an opportunity to be a principal. And so the interview with her was less than 15 minutes. I remember sitting down in that chair. She didn't have a private office. It was what they call a bullpen or bull something office where she was here, her assistant was over here, somebody else was over here, somebody else was behind them, and everybody was talking. And I'm sitting there trying to have, and, my attention span is all over the place. And so it was very hard to focus because there was so much going on in the room. But I remember she set me down in the chair and she said, "How many teachers have you fired?" I was like, "Huh? That's the first interview question?" She said, "How many teachers have you fired? And are you afraid of firing teachers?" And I really didn't have an answer. I didn't know, really didn't know what to say. I was like, I'm not afraid of holding folks accountable, but I don't believe that you can just keep firing people because it's not going to have a negative impact on your culture. And I remember having, she asked me about some of my experiences, and I had a folder, and our test scores from my school in Jacksonville had just came out maybe a couple of days before. And so that was when we went from an F to a C. And so I showed her some of the work that we did and some of the improvements we made. And she literally put a list in front of me. It was a list of all of the elementary schools that were available in DC. And she asked me, "Which one do you want?" And I was like, I don't know. I don't know anything about any of these schools. And so I looked down at the list, and there was one school that was called Lecky. And it kind of rhymed with lucky, and so I said, well, maybe I'll get lucky and I'll just pick this one. And that was literally how I became the principal of Lecky Elementary School. It was the best principal experience I've ever had in my entire life. It was a challenging school. If you know anything about the geography of DC, it's in the southeast, southwest corner. If you travel down 295 before you get to the Maryland border, where now the big hotel and casino and all that other stuff, National Harbor. But before you get to the National Harbor, right down the corner, you have Bowling Air Force Base, and on the other side of 295 was my school. And so it was surrounded on 3 parts by housing projects, about 500 kids, grades K to 5. It was a low-performing school when I arrived, but I had the opportunity here to apply all the mistakes that I had made in other places. I had a chance to kind of do it all over. And so we had a very, very great experience. Okay, I have to tell this one story before I move on. So I know it's probably very, very hard to see, but in the bottom right-hand corner, you see me standing over a gentleman. Does anybody, you probably can't see who that is. Does anybody know who that is? Who? Marion Barry, who, the infamous mayor of DC. At this time, he was a councilman. And so if you know anything about the story of Marion Barry, does anybody know something about Marion? No, nobody? Well, I'm not going to repeat it because I'm going to tell you why I'm not going to repeat it after I tell you the story. Well, he had some issues which caused him to lose his mayoral seat because of some stuff. It was well known, everybody kind of knew about it, and so what I didn't realize is that my school was in his ward. And so I made a demeaning joke about him to my secretary, and some other faculty, staff were around when I said it. I almost said something, but I'm glad I didn't say it. Are we recording? Okay, moving on. So I said something about him, and this picture was taken the very, very next day when this was the summer, so kids weren't in the building, but I walked in, and that chair he's sitting on is right by the exterior part of my office, the back door. And he said to me, "Young man, I heard you had some things to say about me," and this was another lesson learned. Never say anything derogatory about someone who is well beloved, well respected in that particular part of the community. And so that was the second time I had my face handed to me in a platter. Ms. Miller was the first person, and Marion Barry was the second. Anyway, at Lecky Elementary School, I was there for 4 years. Before I talk about some of the things that we were able to accomplish, I want to talk about how we did the work, because many of these things I still hold true and believe these are the right things to do today. The first one was about teacher leadership. So before teacher leadership became the buzzword that it is today, I was literally I had a principal coach at the time, and the coach made me stop doing all of the stuff that I was just accustomed to doing as a principal. So every planning meeting I facilitated, every data meeting I facilitated, I would analyze everybody's data. I would even go as far as to script out their reteaching plans. I would form the intervention groups. I would plan out everything that teachers needed to do. I did every single thing. And I remember my coach saying to me, you're never going to build capacity in folks within your building, and you're never going to grow. Your kids are never going to grow as much as they can grow if you don't learn how to not just distribute leadership, because I didn't have a problem with distributing leadership, but I had a problem with releasing the instructional responsibility to other folks within my building. And so I didn't know anything about teacher leadership at the time, but I quickly, and I really didn't have a choice. The coach just really told me to stop doing all of this stuff. She asked me to identify 2 of my best teachers in the building. She worked with those two particular teachers, and over time, the influence that they had on their peers was greater than I could have ever had. They responded to their peers much better, and by that time, we had built up other teacher leaders on other grade levels. To make this short, within 4 years, teachers were running my entire building. They took ownership over every aspect of the school. My secretary was pretty much like the assistant principal within the school. When we had people out, she was the one who coordinated subs. She was the one who did assignments. Literally in my last year, all I did was show up to school. I did breakfast duty every day. I kept all of the kids in the cafeteria or in the gymnasium where teachers were planning, extended planning time. They came to the cafeteria to get the kids from me. I did lunch duty every single day. I did recess duty every day, and I went home. That was it. Everything else in my building was really ran by teachers. Focus on early literacy and numeracy. You remember me talking in the last slide about you can't test prep your way to school improvement, and you can't take shortcuts. And so it was here that I took the approach. You know, typically in elementary schools, people focus on grades 3 and above because those are the grades that are tested. Well, during my experience here, this is where I took a different approach. Of course, I kept an eye on what was happening in grades 3 through 5, but most of my focus and emphasis was on pre-K, kindergarten, first, and second grade. I mean, that's where I spent most of my time making sure that the kids who came to us, who already came to us with lots of gaps before they walked in the door, that we needed to address those gaps and close those gaps as early as humanly possible so that when they got to second and third and fourth, 5th grade, we weren't spending so much time with interventions and pullouts and tutoring and all those other types of things. Before I knew what social emotional learning was, we spent a lot of time. There was this curriculum that we were piloting called Tools of the Mind. And it was really about teaching kids how to form the right types of relationships with their peers, form the right types of relationships with adults, how to manage, identify their emotions, manage their emotions, make the right types of decisions. And again, before I knew what social emotional learning was, this is what we were doing with our younger grade population. And so, see some other things down there, family, community engagement. Don't have a lot of time to talk about all of that. But within 4 years, like the first year we didn't make any progress on our state assessment and school grades. We actually went down a little. Year 2, we had a little bump, but years 3 and years 4, it was just humongous growth. By the time my kindergartners and first graders who were there when I first came were in now 3rd and 4th grade, like they were killing the assessment. We moved from a priority designation, which was the equivalent of a D, to the designation of rising, which is the equivalent of a B. Lord, I can't see. We increased reading proficiency from 26 to 47%, math from 31 to 60%. We were one of 8 schools in the entire school district, not just in Southeast DC, but all of DC public schools that had significant and sustained 3-year progress for African American students in both reading and math. One of 8 in reading and then one of 13 in math. And you can see some of the other things that were there. The thing that I am most proud of, I think last year in 2021 was the first year that I did not go back to visit the school. Like that school just means so much to me that I pretty much go back every single year. But now we are in 2022. I left there in 2013. The school has never dropped. They have maintained their status since I left. When the year that I left, the parents really petitioned the chancellor not to, they didn't want to send their kids to the neighborhood middle school. And so they added sixth grade after I left. The year after that, they added seventh, and they are a K-8 school, and they've been a K-8 school since I left. Very proud of the work that we accomplished there. That was the end of my, so I didn't tell you that I had this like life plan that I wrote about myself. And so I said that after I was a principal for 10 years, I was going to go and do something else. Where those last 4 years that I was principal at Lecky in DC, that ended my 10-year tenure of being a principal. And again, I didn't have any clue or idea what I wanted to do. Well, I knew what I wanted to do. I didn't know how I was going to make it happen. So you remember me mentioning a couple of slides back that I started a doctoral program at the University of Florida. Never finished, wasted a lot of money, a lot of out-of-pocket money. I always wanted to complete the degree, but I didn't want to come out of my pocket and pay for it anymore. And so I got another one of these random emails. And of course, by this time, I know that the emails aren't necessarily random. I believe it was divinely orchestrated. I got a random email about a federally funded doctoral program. Now, those of you who know about federally funded doctoral programs, they're usually arranged to where you can't necessarily hold a full-time job. I mean, you may have a graduate assistantship or something, but this one, you could work full-time. Everything was paid for. The only caveat was you had to have some type of leadership experience in a school setting or educational setting. And it was a leadership degree, but the emphasis was on early childhood special education. And within that subject area, you could choose from, I think it was maybe 6 or 7 different specialties within that subject area. And so you remember me talking about my experience with African American boys and behavioral disabilities. One of the areas was kids with challenging behaviors. And so I picked that particular area, sent in my paperwork, and they accepted 10 students, 5 1 year, 5 the next. And I was part of the second cohort that was admitted to the University of Colorado, Denver. And so I packed up my car and sent the rest of the stuff on the truck. Pulled out a map to figure out where Colorado was because I had no clue. But I moved to Colorado, started the program at the University of Colorado, Denver. These are a few of my, all of the classmates who were in the cohort with me. And of course, I had to work, needed a job, and so I got a job with Denver Public Schools as an instructional superintendent. And so at the time, Denver was about a 90,000 student district. And my first assignment, I was assigned as the instructional superintendent of the elementary division, and I had all of the elementary schools in the southeast portion of Denver. So the southeast portion of Denver was the most affluent area in Denver. Beautiful homes, like gorgeous homes. Before I ask the question, how long you think I survived in that role, let me tell you a little bit about the schools that I had to supervise. So the interesting fact about some of these schools, all of these schools, is that they had very active PTAs. These PTAs would do, I've heard of silent auctions and all different types of stuff, but these PTAs would raise millions of dollars. Millions, y'all. And every teacher in all of my schools had a full-time teacher assistant that was paid for by the PTA. Kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade, they all had their own teacher assistants. So the issues and problems and challenges that I had to deal with, 99.9% of the time, it was parent related. And it was always parents complaining about something. I've raised all this money. I want my child in Ms. Williams' class. They assigned them to, it was too much. So how long do you think I lasted in that role? 6 months?
3 months.
You're getting close. 2 months. I had enough. That just wasn't my cup of tea. I just couldn't deal with it. And so I walked into my boss's office at the time and I said, listen, give me the worst of what you've got. I'll take the worst schools in the city, but I can't deal with this. And so they actually created a network for me that was called the Transformative Network. And in Colorado, there was a very aggressive school improvement law. And so if you were a failing school for 3 or 4 years, you had to either close, the school would be given to a charter, There were different models or reform models that you can choose from. You can be an innovation school. Innovation schools just simply meant that everybody lost their job, everybody had to reapply. We had even schools that were teacher-led. So we had some schools in Denver that were ran by like a panel of teachers. It was just the panacea of all different types of school models that you can think of. So they gave me 6 schools, had a very, very small network. They gave me 6 schools and a very plush budget. So out of all my colleagues, there were about 8 or 9 of us. My budget was probably triple of the other instructional superintendents. I had 3 literacy specialists on my team. I had 3 math specialists. I had 2 special ed people. I had a behavioral person. I had lots of resources and lots of money to be able to support some of the work in the school. Now, the interesting thing about my experience in Denver was I was always accustomed to working with majority high poverty schools, which always, in most cases, were overwhelmingly African American students. All of my schools in Denver were overwhelmingly majority Hispanic, except for one school. I had one school that was pretty much half and half, but the black population of the school was mostly Sudan refugees. We had a housing project in Denver, and so this was during the time of civil war in Sudan, and so Denver was one of the places where families came, and so they put all the families in one area of town, and they all went to this one school. And so out of those 6 schools, half of them, 3 of them, were, we called them ELA-S schools, which meant that all of the kids were native Spanish speakers. They learned everything in Spanish from kindergarten to half of 3rd grade. They will have English language development for certain portions of the day to learn English. By the time they got to 4th, 5th, and middle school, then they would bridge over into English instruction. And so here I was. I asked for the worst schools. They gave them to me. I didn't speak a lick of Spanish, didn't know what was being said when I would visit schools. But the interesting thing is, for speakers of other languages who are trying to learn English, some of the same skills, supports are what kids who are struggling to read, it's pretty much the same. I mean, there's not a lot of difference between the types of support and explicit instruction that kids need in those foundational skills. The same explicit instruction that kids need to learn English are the same thing, the same skills that kids who speak English but who are struggling to decode and read. It's really the same thing. So, Lord, okay, let me speed up. Was there for 3 years, did some of the same stuff. Now, the only difference in Denver, we had a very progressive superintendent. His name was Tom Boasberg. He was not an educator. He was an international businessman and politician. And so he had a very different perspective on running a district. And so he would experiment with anything. I mean, that's why we had so many different types of models within Denver. And so one of the things that he formalized that I used to not argue, but debate with him about was we had formal teacher leadership roles. And so I don't have time to explain it all, but I'll explain one. So one type of teacher leader were teachers who would work half of the day. So in most cases, depending upon the size of the school, you will have 4 teacher leaders. They will all work half a day. Then you would have 2 full-time teachers who would take their classes the other half of the day. The half of the day that the teacher leaders were not teaching, they were coaching, supporting, and actually evaluating their peers. Their formal evaluations were done by their peer teacher, not the school administrator. And so I used to argue with him, well, not argue, debate with him that, no, you can't coach somebody and be their evaluator. I mean, he would say to me, then what do principals do? It's like, well, they coach and they evaluate. But it was a different teacher leadership model that I had learned in DC, in Denver, and it actually worked. Like, it actually worked. So anyway, I know I'm running out of time. So teacher leadership, again, focus on early literacy and numeracy. My 3 literacy specialists that I had within my network, we had so many kids who were reading, multiple grade levels behind, that I did some controversial things that, a lot of people didn't necessarily agree with, but like, to me, literacy is a foundation of every single thing. If you can't decode and make meaning of words, If you can't comprehend, you can't do anything else. And so we had so many students who were so far behind that we taught literacy, spent a lot of time on those foundational skills, phonics, phonemic awareness, almost half of the school day, which means that there were some content areas that we didn't ever touch. And I did that for an entire semester because I strongly believed that we needed to prioritize making sure that all the gaps that our kids had, that they were closed before they went on to the next grade. Long story short, 50% of our schools moved from F to yellow or F to a C. 25% of them moved from an F to a B. The school that I talked about, oh gosh, I can't remember the name, but it was a school where we had most of the Sudanese refugees. That was one of my schools that went from an F to a B. Very proud of Antoinette was the principal. She was the only, we had 2 black principals in all of Denver. Antoinette was one of them. She led this particular school. She is now an instructional superintendent and doing a great job in Denver. But we had a lot of success. All of the schools came off of the intervention list. 50% of our schools ranked in the top 40 of all district schools in growth in ELA or math. The thing that I was most proud of was the fact that our English language learners in our network were the only English language learners in the entire district to see an increase in their English proficiency. And so we have the state assessment test, and then we had, gosh, I can't remember the name of the, Access. Was it Access? It was a test to measure how successful the kids who spoke Spanish were transitioning to English. I think it was Access. But anyway, had a lot of great progress on that assessment as well. So I left Denver. I wanted to get back down south. I left out all of the information about my kids and how we were flying all over the place. They were flying back and forth. I was flying back and forth, trying to make sure I was making games, activities, and all these other types of things. And so it was, I was broker than broke. And so I needed to get back closer so that I can be a little closer to them that will help ease some of the trouble that I was experiencing with trying to get back and forth and then flying back. Now, they will tell you to this day, they still want me to go back to Denver. That was a place where they had the most, okay, I have so many stories and I'm running out of time. So let me be quiet and move on. So tried to get back to Florida. That didn't work out. By the time they made me an offer, it was too late. The school year had already started. And so I moved to Philly where my mentor was the superintendent at the time, Dr. Bill Hite, who just retired a couple months ago as a superintendent, school district of Philadelphia. 160,000 kids. My region, when I was an assistant superintendent in Philadelphia, was larger than the entire district of Little Rock. But I only stayed there for a year. Don't really have much to talk about other than I love living in Philly. And so I had an opportunity to come back down south to Alabama. I was recruited by the state superintendent. The new state superintendent in Alabama knew someone who used to work in Denver. And so he wanted to establish this new Office of Turnaround and School Improvement at the State Department in Alabama to help support and spur improvement in schools and districts throughout the state who were struggling. And so I just jumped at the opportunity, didn't do a lot of research, didn't know anything about Alabama, came down to Montgomery, and one of the first decisions that he made as state superintendent, and I'm sure this is going to resonate with many of you in this room, was to take over Montgomery Public Schools, which was the public school district that was in the capital city of Alabama. And just probably the same way that this community responded to the state when they took over Little Rock Public Schools was probably the same way that that community responded when I came down there. And so I happened to be the face of this intervention into Montgomery Public Schools, and I was charged with figuring out how to make it work. And it was the worst experience of my professional life. Another thing that I realized very quickly, I grew up in Florida, as you know, and I used to always tell people that I was from the South. It wasn't until I got to Montgomery that I realized I was not from the South. And so, yeah. So many stories I can tell, but I'm going to move on. So he was eventually fired. Well, he resigned before he was fired by the state board. And so I left, went down the street to Birmingham City Schools, where I was the chief academic and accountability officer for Birmingham for 2 years. Birmingham had the illustrious distinction of being the district in the state of Alabama that had the most failing schools than any other district in the state. Lord. So we did some work there. Not going to go over all of this, but we decreased the number of F-rated schools from 22 to 6 and increased the number of C-rated schools that were C or above from 6 to 17. What was interesting about Birmingham, those 6 schools that had grades of C and above, they were all magnet schools with selective admission requirements. So none of our regular neighborhood schools were performing above a C or better. But we did a whole lot of work, and I know I'm skipping over a lot, but this was hard work, you all. The biggest issue in Birmingham was adult culture. And when I say adult culture, I'm talking about that's where I met Mr. Lee, who is my assistant. He worked with me in Alabama, and he's here with us now in Little Rock. And so he can tell you people were very set in their ways, very resistant to change, not welcoming to any outsider, just was used to doing what they were doing and just wasn't really interested in making change. And this was probably one of the first opportunities where I had to really use the power of accountability and really hold our leaders accountable for just doing the jobs that we were paying people to do. So after those 2 years, after the experiences there, I felt like I was ready to take the superintendent plunge. And so the first superintendent assignment that I was blessed to have was in Mississippi. And people always ask me, how in the world did you end up in Mississippi? Well, quick little story. It's not even a story, it's just a statement. When I was a principal in DC, my chief academic officer was Kerry Wright, who was the state superintendent in Mississippi. And so if you paid any attention to what has been happening in Mississippi for the last 10 years, she just retired a couple of months ago. Mississippi used to be at the bottom of every single list for every single thing. But if you've been paying attention, our NAEP scores for like the last 5-6 years, Mississippi is during the last administration, we were only one of two states in the entire nation that saw dramatic increases in literacy. And it was because of a lot of the policies that she put in place in that state. And so I came to Mississippi, and they created what was called the Mississippi Achievement School District, which was designed and orchestrated to provide support to the lowest performing districts in the state. And so I was hired for this role, and the 2 districts that were assigned to me were Yazoo City and Humphreys County. And so I was responsible for running 2 districts in the Mississippi Delta. No blueprint, no plan, no support. They literally hired me and said, these are the districts that we're giving you, go forth and be blessed. And that was literally how it happened. And so I was excited because I get a chance to, the boards were done away with, so I didn't have a board. I was superintendent in board. I didn't have to report to a board. I could do what I felt that we needed to do without having a lot of red tape, so to speak. But even with that type of latitude, you all, Lord have mercy. I had no idea. I've worked in urban environments all my life, but urban poverty and rural poverty and everything that's associated with rural poverty, it's just different. It's dramatically different. And so it was tough work. I am running out of time, so I don't even know what stories to tell you, but it was tough work. I had never seen such extreme levels of poverty. I have never seen families who were some of the most hospitable people on the face of this earth, who would cook for you, who would do whatever, but were satisfied with their plight in life. They were satisfied. You know, a lot of people born there, stayed there, never left, and they were content. And so you had that. You also had districts who were very poor, and the funding in Mississippi, you know, most of the school's funding comes from the local contribution. The state contributes as well, but you depend upon your local contribution to fund your schools. And your local contribution comes from ad valorem taxes from homeowners. There were hardly any homeowners where I worked. And so, no exaggeration, we had a district of about 4,000 kids. Our ad valorem contribution every year was just a little bit above $3 million, which wasn't even enough to fund staffing at one school. And so I worked there for 3 years, promised that we would get some extra resources in terms of fiscal resources and human resources. I was there for 3 years, never got anything. So all we had to work with was what the local districts generated and what we got from the state. And these are places where, Melissa, who's up here, she's our new chief academic officer. She worked with me in Birmingham with a partner organization that helped us do a lot of work in Birmingham. And I tried to recruit people like Melissa to come to Mississippi. Nobody would come. I don't care who I call, I don't care who I tried to commit, like no one would come. No one would come to help me, and we could not attract other teachers or other folks to come there. When I arrived, we had one elementary school who was the worst elementary school in the entire state, 10 classes of third graders in the school, one certified teacher. And in Mississippi, if the kids don't pass the third grade reading test, they're retained. And so you can imagine my first year when I got there, the number of kids who were retained, it was just like, it was hell. Can't say it too loud, but it was a dramatic experience. But even with all of that, we were still able to accomplish some things, again, just by holding people accountable and ensuring that they at least attempted to do what we hired them to do. And then we were able to put some things in place to make some differences in the lives of the children who were in those towns. And the interesting thing for me is that the needs of the children and the children themselves, despite their circumstances, the kids weren't any different than any other place that I worked. For many of them, they just lacked the ability, and this is so sad because this is I think the first time I encountered this on such a mass level. A lot of the students there didn't even have the ability to dream and think of something bigger than where they were. And so it was a challenge in and of itself just to get them to, great kids now. You didn't have there wasn't a lot of behavioral issues per se, but it was just I don't know how to describe it, just the culture of the area. People were just okay. They were just okay and complacent. But even with that, we were able to, both districts were on, had lost accreditation by the time we arrived. Like the financial issues, y'all, whoo, Lord. I went a whole year and a half before I even had a budget, before I even knew what we had. I went through five CFOs within 2 years because they kept making mistakes, kept telling us we had this, we didn't have that. We had millions of dollars that were expended inappropriately, federal funds, money we had to pay back. It was crazy. It was the craziest experience I have ever had. And one of the reasons why I decided halfway through, towards the end of year 2, that I was going to give this a shot for another year, but this was really not sustainable. I was promised some additional resources. They never happened. But we were working 7 days a week, 29 hours a day, and if I had remained there, I would have lost it. So it was hard to make the decision to transition from there, but I knew that work wasn't going to be sustainable, and I knew that if I'm not from that area, and if I am taking more of an interest in trying to do something than the people who are there, like I just had to make a hard decision. Like I can't give more than the people who were already in the state who needed to be a little bit more committed and dedicated to helping the community versus someone who was from the outside. So ended up here, glad to be here. One of the reasons I was in 3 superintendent searches here, New Orleans, and I don't know, I can't ever remember the name of the district. It's right outside of Kansas City, Missouri, Raytown. But one of the reasons that I really fell in love before I even visited Little Rock was because of all the financial issues that I had in Mississippi. I studied this budget and I realized that there's some resources here. So there are some things that could support the work that we needed to get done. And then the second thing was there is such support and a willingness and a desire from pretty much everybody within this city to want to see the Little Rock School District do well. I've had meetings and spent a lot of time with people on a wide range of the political spectrum, wide range of the philosophical spectrum within the city, but everybody, regardless of what differences we may have, everybody wants this city to do well, because a city can't be great unless they have a great public school system. And although everybody's motives may not be necessarily pure, the fact is that they want the school district to do well, because there's an economic, can't think of the word I'm looking for. There's an economic goals, I guess. You get what I'm trying to say. So there's a lot of momentum here. And third thing, I don't think I've said this in any of the forums that we've had before. I know I've said it in other settings. But one thing that's unique about Little Rock, it is, of course, it's an urban district. And when you compare Little Rock to other urban districts throughout our country, you can look at Atlanta's, you can look at DC's. Trying to make sure I say this in the right way. But you don't see a lot of affluent families, regardless of what race they are. You don't see a sizable number of affluent families still supporting the public school system in urban districts. And here in Little Rock, we still have quite a substantial number of affluent families who still send their kids to Little Rock School District. That's not the case in many other places. And so that's something very, very unique about this city. And I am over my time, but I'm going to speed up. A lot of good stuff going on here. Don't have time to talk about it. But there's a lot of great things within our school district that we can celebrate and be proud of. There is also a lot of work that we need to do. If you don't mind if you need to leave, you can feel free to leave. But I'm going to go on just a little bit, maybe five more minutes. We've got some work to do with student outcomes, got some challenges with our enrollment, and then some issues with the culture of our organization that we need to address. So real quick, I'll talk about some student outcomes. These are our graduation rates over the last 5 years. I know you probably can't see it, but I'll just make this very, very quick. On average, we graduate 80% of our students every single year. When you look at the number of graduates in our district, it's about 1,600 kids every single year who should be graduating. We graduate about 80% of those. And so 20% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you actually quantify that number, that's about 320 kids every single year. And when you look at the group of kids who are being negatively impacted the most, the interesting thing is when you look at our graduation rate for this year, the African American student graduation rate is slightly higher than the average graduation rate in the city. The group that is suffering the most are our Hispanic students and our ESOL students. Even when you look at our gifted and talented students, I can't see that well, and it's cut off just a little, but even our gifted and talented subgroup of students, their graduation rates aren't really that high. It's at 93% this last year. And so we got a lot of work to do. A lot of students are falling through the crack, and so we got a lot of work to do to address those. These are our math scores over the last 5 years. You can see that we only have one grade level, and I believe that is, I can't see the grade level, but I think that's 10th grade that is performing in 2022. The number of kids who are proficient are slightly higher than it was 5 years ago. All others are low. And then the yellow is the state average, which isn't that great, period. But at least, at the very least, we should be aiming to be at least meeting the state average. Science, 8th grade is the only grade that is performing near or higher than where students were performing prior to the pandemic. This is English. And don't have the time to spend about reading, but the good thing, there is some positive about our reading trends this year in particular. All those areas that I circled, we saw increases from 2021 to 2022, although it's still very low. We are making some progress. Enrollment declines. We all know that money is tied to the number of students in our district, and so when you look over the last 10 years, we are down about almost 1,900 kids prior to the pandemic. After the pandemic, we are down 3,043 kids that we have lost over a 10-year period of time. The good news is from 2021 to 2022, we actually gained 442 students. And so I'm hoping that trend will continue. When you break this down, elementary, middle, and high, this was interesting to me because in my mind, I thought that we lost most of our kids at the middle school level. But we're actually losing pretty much the overwhelming percentage of them at the elementary level. 3,000 kids we've lost at the elementary level in 10 years. We actually have more kids at the middle school level today than we had 10 years ago. Okay, running out of time, but many different elements of our culture that we're going to address. The only thing that I want to talk to this group about was our efforts as a district to really be more intentional about how we engage our stakeholders, which is all of you, in helping us to address the many problems that we have in our district. And so there will be many opportunities that you'll begin to hear about where we want to engage you in helping us to solve some of the issues and problems that we have. We have a lot of big issues that we're going to have to face in the next 1 or 2 years. We've got boundary issues. We've got enrollment issues that we've got to deal with. We're building a new high school out west, building the J.A. Fair K-8 building, and that building is going to have to be populated with kids, and so we got to figure out where the kids are going to come from, which means there will be some more schools that may have to close, which may not necessarily be a bad thing because they'll be in a new building with new resources, and so a lot of decisions we got to make. I will be intentional about reaching out to different segments of our community on a consistent basis to continue dialogue, to continue problem solving around some of our issues, and these are just some examples of things that will happen. All right, now your turn. In the, I was going to say few minutes that we have left, there aren't really any minutes left, but I do want to take an opportunity to get some feedback from you. So when you arrive, you have these little cards. There are 3 questions. The first 2 questions you don't really have to answer, but I'm really interested to know what are the top 3 priorities you think we as a district should prioritize? What are the top 3 issues you think as a community that we should prioritize? We will take a look at this data. This is our last meeting, and so I really hope that you feel the sincerity in my plea and my statement that we really want to involve all of you to help us figure out the best solutions to some of the issues that we have, and for our stakeholders to realize that this school district belongs to you. It's not mine, it doesn't belong to the board, it belongs to the community of Little Rock. And so I want to engage you to be active partners and participants with us in that process. So either you can fill out the physical forms and drop them off at the table when you leave, or if you want to be fancy, there's a QR code on the cards. You can just scan them with your phones, and if you complete the digital one, then it'll just come directly to us. All right. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for staying over the extra minutes that you did. I do still want to, for those of you who may have some pressing questions or some burning questions or comments, I will entertain a few before we officially dismiss. Any questions or comments? Right, I want to acknowledge 2 of my 9 bosses who are in the room. We have Ms. Hatter over there. Raise your hand. And I was going to say my favorite, but I don't want Ms. Hatter to get mad. Ms. Norma Johnson, I believe this is is this your zone? Yeah, your zone. All right, and Ms. Norma Johnson, who is here. And Ms. Norma Johnson, who is here. Thank you. Salute that. All right, if there isn't anything else, please fill out those cards or complete the QR codes. Have a great evening.